My name is Bud Lawrence. I served in the Navy in World War II, and I'm also a retired executive with over 30 years of managerial service to the paper industry. Portland, Oregon has been my home since 1967. During World War II, I was engineering officer on an LST, which stands for Landing Ship Tank. The story I have to tell you is of my involvement in a naval maritime disaster in May 1944, when 6 LSTs blew up in an inferno of flame and carnage. This horrible tragedy took place on the island of Oahu in an area known as West Loch. It lies in the shadow of the other place of infamy, Pearl Harbor. There wasn't news of this calamity in the U.S. at that time because of the necessity of wartime censorship. This year, 1994, marks the 50th anniversary of that event, which occurred on the 21st of May 1944, 3 years after the Pearl Harbor attack. I think it is important to remember those who were hurt and perished at West Loch on that day in May. The 163 sailors and Marines who died and the 396 who were injured. I'd like to begin this story by showing what I looked like near the time of the disaster. Here I am, a US Navy Lieutenant JG. What a contrast to what I look like now. Let's see what a LST is all about. Here's a picture of one of LSTs on your screen. I spent a year and a half on this kind of ship and know a little something about its purpose. The LST was uniquely designed for landing on a beach to unload invasion forces and supplies. They played a key role in the island-hopping invasions of the Pacific War against Japan and the invasions in Europe. The LST of World War II was about 300 feet long and 50 feet wide. Because of its design to carry Army tanks, a large portion of the ship was dedicated to that purpose by the use of a central core or tank deck. The tank deck was directly underneath the top deck of the ship. At the forward end of the tank deck was a ramp which could be lowered after the bow doors were open to unload equipment onto the beach, or as a special capability, unload in open water where amphibious tanks were involved. LSTs were identified by number only. No names were given to them, but the crews would occasionally nickname them. My ship was known as LST129 by the Navy records. By us, it was known as USS WWII. Now that you know a little more about the LST and what it does, I'd like to explain in detail my experience at the West Loch disaster. The unfortunate LSTs that were destroyed at West Loch were part of a large amphibious landing force whose objective was to be the Japanese-held island of Saipan. The combat loading of the LSTs for this invasion force made them a combination troop and ammunition ship. As an example, my LST had about 80 50-gallon drums of 100-octane gasoline on the extreme front end of the ship, known as the forecastle. In the center of the main deck was a 150-ton LCT, which is carried piggyback by our LST. The LCT was a landing craft tank, a miniature version of an LST for tactical use in the invasion area. On the rear of my ship was stored 500 rounds of 5-inch .38 ammunition for use on destroyers. Down below, on the back end of the tank deck, 10 tons of TNT blocks were stored. From the TNT forward were many combat-ready amphibious tanks loaded with gasoline and ammunition. These tanks were to be used by the Marines to attack the beachhead. This kind of combat loading was typical of most of the LSTs at West Loch. The high explosive and volatile nature of the supplies we carried made us very nervous, as you can imagine. While we were loaded with all these explosives and equipment, the entire LS2 group was sent out to sea on what was to be a practice invasion exercise off the coast of Maui. We encountered heavy seas that stopped the exercise after it was determined that the heavy weather made landings impractical. During this exercise, my LST broke the hinges on the bow ramp and required repairs upon return to West Loch. That's a scenario for the following events. It was during the nighttime we were returning to West Loch that the heavy seas caused 3 of the LSTs to lose their LCTs and be washed overboard. In the process, 19 Marines were drowned. Though a small episode in the chronicles of the war, it was no less a tragic occurrence. The next morning we beached our LST at West Loch so we could weld the broken hinges while the ramp was resting on the beach. The welding was done directly under the main deck, where, as you might recall, the 80 drums of aviation gasoline were stored. That morning, as we repaired our LST, the remainder of the invasion force was situated in what are known as tears, or moored side by side. If you're still wondering where West Loch is, let me explain. On the island of Oahu, and here is a map of the island, we can see Pearl Harbor. Enlarged in that view, we can now see the location of West Loch as shown in the window. On May 21st, 1944, the West Loch would have looked like this with my LST and others at moorage. While in the port, our ship, as a matter of routine, would check our stores and resupply those items as needed. On that morning, I was in charge of getting fresh supplies, and so was sent with a small crew of men to Pearl Harbor Supply Depot about 6 miles away. Shortly after leaving that supply depot in the afternoon, we heard a loud explosion and saw a black cloud billowing up like a mushroom from about the direction of where our LST was located. Our first reaction to the sight was that our LST was blowing up, possibly because of the welding repairs so close to the aviation fuel on the deck. We quickly accelerated to full throttle and headed to our LST129. When we reached the location shown as X on the map, we could see it was not our ship ablaze, but one of the ships in Tier 8 on fire. It was a terrible sight. There were men jumping off the burning ship trying to escape. Seeing this, I asked our crew, "Do you want to go in and pick them up?" referring to the Marine and sailors who were now in the water. My crew immediately said, "Let's go." By the time we got to the men in the water, there were several LSTs exploding and burning. We were astern of the ship they jumped from. We began to pull the men aboard out of the water. I was pulling one of these men in with my back to the ships on fire when a tremendous blast rocked the boat and blew me into the water also. Within seconds, after being thrown in the water, the LCVP I was blown from backed over me. How I ever managed to avoid the craft's propellers is a mystery to me. When I surfaced, I grabbed a life ring that was thrown to me, which is sure gratefully accepted since I didn't swim very well. Several LSTs were attempting to back away from those on fire and exploding. In the process of backing off, the surviving LSTs created a strong current that swept me under the stern of one of the exploding LSTs, the 179. Luckily, I was able to grab a metal ring known as a pad-eye on the LST I was swept into. This pad-eye was just a few feet above the waterline and above the LST's rudder. I managed to pull myself up into a sitting position on top of the rudder, which itself was just beneath the water surface by a foot. After catching my breath and looking around at my grim circumstance, I suddenly realized that a few feet away from me, within the burning LST, was a stockpile of explosives in the ship's powder magazine. Putting this thought aside, I looked around me, and through the black smoke I saw two men in the water near me. I was alarmed because I could see they were helplessly being swept into the water between the burning LSTs. The water they were heading into was ablaze from the oil on the surface. I wrestled with my life ring while at the same time trying to hang on to the pad-eye, and with a heave threw the life ring towards the two hapless men in the water. There was a rope attached to the life ring, which I held with one hand, while with my other maintained a grip on the pad-eye. I was holding on in this way for what seemed like ages, but in actuality was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. My arms were getting extremely weak, but by good fortune, a boat saw us, the nearly tragic situation, and headed towards us. Daring the possibility of the LST exploding, they were able to get close enough to me to pass the life ring rope on which the two men of the water depended on for their lives. The boat pulled the two men aboard and then attempted to throw the life ring to me. I reached out and grabbed it, and I was pulled off the rudder and through this first stinky, filthy water, and then increasingly violent explosions on the LSTs. Wearily, my eyes were burning, and I was finally picked out of the water and pulled aboard the rescue boat. At once, the boat set out for the aid station set up at the ammunition depot on the south end of West Loch. The aid station doctors examined me and then shipped me off to the hospital at Aiea Heights, which was some distance away. I have no recollection of how I wound up at the hospital. I suspect I was sedated due to my vomiting and being in a state of shock. After several days recuperating in the hospital, I was visited by Kenny Banks, my roommate aboard ship. Boy, was I glad to see him, and vice versa. He said that the crew of my LST had been given me up for dead. I learned from him that my ship was leaving for the invasion immediately. I pleaded with the doctor to release me for the voyage, but he refused. When I was finally released several days later, I was flown by a Navy supply plane along with other mission critical parts to the island of Kwajalein. There I waited for a week for my ship to arrive. When I finally went aboard ship, it was a very happy reunion with my shipmates. As a result of the heroic action taken by my boat crew during the rescues at West Loch, all received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, which is awarded on the occasion of great courage and self-sacrifice.